Without water, we would be nothing. It's something our next guest, environmental writer David Young, is on a mission to remind us through a new book, Why Pacifica. It's an exploration of how water has been revered and understood by Indigenous cultures across the wider Pacific region. David Young's drawn upon decades of exchanges with Indigenous elders and experts from Aotearoa and Australia to Hawaii and Oregon, looking at customary uses, traditions and myths of life-sustaining water, or why. He argues that Western culture is at risk of getting stuck in its current wasteful trend of how it uses and regards water, and a different approach is needed. David Young is with us now. Tēnā koe, welcome.
Morena, Catherine. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
You've written books about water before. Why the particular focus on fresh water in the Pacific?
I was fortunate enough to be able to go to Hawaii on a fellowship for about 4 months, 10 years ago now, just over. And because I had done so much around rivers in New Zealand, I thought it would be really interesting to explore how a cousin culture of the Māori had actually interacted with their landscape, which is actually a very different one from Aotearoa, even though it's an archipelago, and to actually examine just to what extent they revered water. So that was where it started, and I found that because Hawaiians developed a very successful way of using water through this magnificent use of irrigation, Hawaii, and the ahupuaha system of running agriculture from the mountains to the sea, whereby a whole clan of Hawaiians would maintain the flows in the water for the taro, but they would also ensure that what came out the other end into the sea was discharged, was pure, because they kept fish in it to deal with the extra minerals that you didn't really want to go into the sea. And I discovered that where there was enough rain, they were able to set up these amazing systems that meant that when Cook arrived, there were probably 800,000 people living on a pretty small area of land across about 6 islands. So that was their approach. It was very managerial, and that it had shaped their culture, whereas Māori had come to this archipelago and discovered there was more water here than they could ever have imagined. But the miracle with them was that they too had retained an enormous respect for water, notwithstanding the plenitude of it. In Western culture, it's usually rarity that guarantees that we value something. But for Māori, over those 700 years plus that they've been here, they've never lost that amazing reverencing of water, and I've always been fascinated by it. So that's where the book began.
Where did it take you, though? Literally take you in exploring more widely how the cultures of the Pacific have commonalities and perhaps also some differences? Well,
yes, I think that because land shapes us as a people when we're close to it, that there are differences right across the Pacific. And I felt very strongly that at the bottom of it all, there was a commonality with Indigenous culture, which was based on a very different and much more subtle view of the world than we now have in Western culture. I mean, it's a cliche now to say we were all Indigenous not so long ago, but the West, it seems to me, has lost the important principles of connection and community and reverencing of water, even if it's simply as a way of finding contemplation. And so I feel that there is still a gift being held out by Indigenous cultures right across the Pacific to people who've changed their world so much, saying, well, look, if you just slowed down a wee bit and you thought a little bit more about what you were doing and you actually listened to some of our values, that you might find that some of the issues that are causing so much mayhem for the land and for our communities, that these could actually be, if not dealt with, at least diminished in all sorts of ways. And there's no place on earth like New Zealand for these lessons to be learned.
It's beautifully illustrated as well, and I know there's a family connection there. But what was it that you were trying to convey through the whole book, the whole project?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you use that word whole, because I think that we do have a lot of difficulty dealing with a holistic approach to nature. And yes, all human beings, when they've settled on other lands, have made some terrible errors, and they've been responsible for lots of loss of species. But the indigenous people still retain this amazing way of seeing the world, which brings in the spiritual, the physical, and the natural. And we can't become them, but I think that when we stand beside them and listen to them, we can still find ways of connecting with nature that I think will serve us best. And I think we're off the rails at the moment. And a lot of this book I completed during the 4 years of the previous President of the United States, where it seemed that not only was democracy and nature in trouble, but that it was actually things were going backwards. And I was thinking, well, it's very easy to be critical about what's going on even in your own country, but I felt that New Zealand was a place where you could still stand and radiate, if you like, a sort of light and a certain amount of optimism about the possibility of turning things around. So that was very much a part of it, Catherine. And of course, underneath that, there are all kinds of words like integrated management. There was a missionary in the early 19th century who walked through Big Island in Hawaii, and when he looked at the ahupua'a, he spoke in the words that only words he had, which was, he talked of the smiling gaiety of the whole, where he found water being used in integrated ways for supporting a variety of crops and supporting considerable populations who seem to be somewhat at one with the planet. And in modern Hawaii, you've still got that approach filtering down as small communities who are regenerating their old lands and their old landscapes, are actually also regenerating their cultures. So when I was back on Kauai about 3 years ago, it was amazing to find that even something like tourism and the way in which people in large numbers wearing sun cream could descend on a beach, that was worrying them because of what it was doing. They could see what it was doing to the fish because they're so close to where they're living with nature, that they actually put a ban on using sun cream in that area. And it's now, I think, become law across Hawaii that sun cream in water is no longer allowed.
You talk about the reverence. I'm curious as to whether you were saying within New Zealand, across all cultures, across all peoples, a shift. You made a very good point when you said our economic systems, our Western economic systems anyway, and value scarcity. That's when the price of something goes up, when it's scarce. And the point you make about many of these indigenous cultures, in some instances where they do have to work for water supplies, and you'll explain perhaps a little bit more about the case in Hawaii, or in the case of New Zealand where there was ample water and now it's a question of how we are managing it. I'm curious as to whether that scarcity and the exploitation of resources that sits alongside it, you are really seeing a shift across many New Zealanders, and more than just a sort of a nostalgic longing for being able to swim in a river. Is it going deeper and wider?
Well, I think it is. And as you will be aware, Catherine, this is happening on a number of planes, but perhaps the most obvious one is the way in which so many tens of thousands of New Zealanders have embraced the efforts to bring back natural biodiversity into their regions. And the Billion Trees Project has actually had quite an effect in the area where we live, which is in the Tasman district. And a lot of that money is being used to bring back the restoration of riparian planting, which of course has been a song we've heard many times over. But these people are just part of the QE2 movement with those, 180,000 hectares of protected covenants, and the way in which people are engaged with offshore islands and mainland islands and so on. Within that, there's usually also, not always, an association with the tangata whenua. Often they're so stretched they can't get to these things anyway. But I think we are finding that people who perhaps come with a scientific background, the most dedicated people are farmers and perhaps ecologists who do this work, but there's lots of ordinary people doing it now, and they're being exposed sometimes to what Māori want to do whenever you do make some step towards changing nature, in this case hopefully for the better. And so there's prayer, there's karakia and so on, and so there's this whole invitation again to actually just pay attention to the bigger things around us that we, in our headlong existence now, have so little time for. So I think that is going on, Catherine, and I think it's very obvious within national radio at the moment the way in which we are recognising te reo, and the way in which even the Royal Society, for instance, has now brought in formally Matauranga Māori, the living, ongoing knowledge of the Māori culture, formally into their systems. And I know not all scientists like this, but I actually think it's a wonderful thing that's going on in New Zealand.
You don't see them in conflict. It seems sometimes to become a question of conflict,
yes,
as opposed to parallel and informing cultures and knowledge in the broadest sense.
Yeah, well, I don't personally. I think we must continue to uphold science. There's no question about that. We'd be in real trouble without it. But I think that we can have more than that. And I don't see Matauranga Māori and science as some kind of binary. And there are some instances, of course, where the work that Alan Mark did on tussocks, for instance, back when he came back from his PhD in America and had started working on tussocks, that he discovered after a while that using some amazing techniques that tussocks were capable of absorbing huge amounts of moisture in the form of mist mostly, fog, and holding it until the land could actually take it, thereby contributing enormously to the water and soil conservation of that steep country, which he knows so well. And then you discover that a little bit further down in his work, he discovers that that there are scientific differentials that you can find in isotopes between water, depending on whether it comes from rainfall or perhaps it's coming from mist or even perhaps snow. And then I discover, and that's probably one of the things that triggered this book, was a comment from it was a story from a tohunga in the central North Island saying to me that there were in Māoridom these distinctions that they understood about these different qualities of water depending on from where they came, and how and why that was known to them. And he told me a story that I didn't feel at liberty to relate, but it's a wonderful story about the discovery of this differential. And I actually think, I'm not saying that all Māori beliefs are going to in any way line up with good science, but it's astonishing sometimes when you do come across this.
Staying with fog, because what you've been talking about relates to this part of the book. It doesn't typically feature in our consideration of the water cycle, but you also talk about fog trapping in Chile's Atacama Desert. Is this related?
Yes, it is. And yes, I first heard about this at a seminar in Hawaii from a Chilean contributor, and then I realised that it actually was quite widespread among those Indigenous people, the Atacama Desert, which where they've actually done this for years, and it's one of the driest places on the planet. And they use various techniques. These days they tend to put up a sail, but in previous times they used whatever they could to actually. Obviously, the flow was coming from the coast towards the mountain, and they were able to actually gather sufficient water to survive in these very inhospitable places. It's paradoxically that area, of course, as you probably know, is now where a great deal of mining is going on for some of the primary constituents in our battery-powered electric cars.
You devote a chapter to the Whanganui River, of course, the first river in the world to be bestowed a legal personhood under the law. And again, are we seeing, over your lifetime, certainly writing, more and more coming together of the law that we have inherited from, from England largely, and the laws, both cultural and traditional, but also the belief systems of our Indigenous people, our respective cultures and their systems coming together more than you have seen perhaps at any time in your writing.
Well, I think one of the people who's been dead for a long time, who's inspired me to stick at this kind of mahi, was a 100-year-old tohunga on the Whanganui River, whom I also acknowledge again in the book, who had actually fought for his people's river, knowing that it had been taken not even through skullduggery, but just through kind of very poor law. It was the Coal Mines Act that actually allowed the Crown to sort of to take charge of the Whanganui River on its navigable reaches. So he certainly was the person who inspired me to stay with this kind of work. And the weird thing about, I think this is an answer to your question, about his mission was that finally, after starting in 1926 with various court cases, it got to 1964 and it finished up in the Māori Appellate Court, as it was called then, which was a group of so-called experts from the Māori Land Court. They were all extremely white, and I don't think particularly. I think we find them particularly nice people today, and they just dismissed out of hand really his attempts to explain what a relationship is, which is the key word for all Indigenous people, what their relationship was, how relational it actually was in history and their own personal interactions and their healing and their gathering of food and so on and so on. And they just dismissed this out of hand. And when they talked about the legends or the stories that had actually allowed the people of the river to come together, they just talked about it as some kind of superstition. So that's 64. I'm not far off leaving school at that time, and in Wanganui as it happens, and here we are now with a river that has been recognised by the Crown as having. People often talk about this legal personality, which is not a phrase I particularly like because it does come from the corporate world, which. I don't think rivers really need to be too minded about that. But what the essential thing about that legislation is that it recognises the relationship between the tangata whenua of the river and all its layering, its history and its legends and the interactions I was talking about before. And so I think that's a huge move. And of course, Te Urewera, there's been recognition there of the fact that they should have got that in the 1890s when Seddon promised it back to them, and it didn't happen until very recently. But I think legally this is a very exciting world we're living in, and when you get the man behind the Y262 claim, which is really all about what was most precious to Māori in nature, Joe Williams going to the Supreme Court and making arguments about how mana can actually apply even beyond a person's life. I think we're living in a very dynamic cultural relationship. even though I think those who venture there have got to have strong constitutions and be prepared not just for aroha, but for, a lot of challenge. Yes, exactly.
David, what of your own life's experience with this as well? Because, it's where you do go. In your introduction, you state that the book is an exploration of the Indigenous reflections and uses of water, quote, from the perspective of an Aotearoa New Zealand Pākehā. And do you feel like you had to make that explicit? Is it important to state who you are?
I think so, Catherine. I think that I would never want it to be thought that I was telling tangata whenua anywhere in the Pacific where, what they might be thinking or what they should think or anything like that. But I felt and the other thing, of course, is that there are many voices from Indigenous people that I sought out and who are very happy. And it's very much this Pākehā trying to figure out, well, we know that our system is not serving either the people or the land. What have these people got to say? And how best to express it? So, yes, I actually did attempt to sometimes write the book somewhat immersively as well, so to give a sense that, yes, a Pākehā can ask these questions, and there are many wonderful people who can give you answers, but also that you can actually at times experience stuff that, for instance, we all know that you wash your hands after you've been to a cemetery if you're paying respect to the kaua of the urapa. And I was thinking about this yesterday, that when I was doing a lot of work around Whakatohea in the 1990s, I was doing research for them, and I was involved in a film for TV, a doco for TV3 about the treaty and so on. And one day I was walking towards a battle site that was very famous, and as I walked towards it, I suddenly got this incredible feeling, like an electric shock across both my inside palms of my hands. And this thought came to me immediately that this was actually a place where someone had been felled in battle. And all of a sudden, and this is sort of bringing Maori, in inverted commas, superstition back into the so-called real world, I'd love to see some science done on this, because I think that, again, one is reminded that that this is the kind of thing that when you are actually open and listening to the earth, as people in Hawaii and Aotearoa like to say, can actually connect you, not in ways you may not necessarily want to be connected.
We are seeking, I think, in these very challenging times, a reconnection with the wholeness of who we are as natural physical beings in a natural physical world. I think for mental health, people are seeking that, as well as the consensus that's growing around the damage that we've done to nature, and that we need to be looking to restore it. Has it brought you a sense of peace, or a satisfaction's not the right word, having been prepared to go into a world that for many, many decades for New Zealanders was, a different world, and didn't have the courage perhaps to venture and find what you've found?
Well, yes. I mean, I think growing up on the Whanganui River was an education. We lived not very far from the river, but we were never encouraged to engage with it, because it was big, and it was, moreover, very dirty, until some wonderful work began to be done by the council in the 80s, and in response to the local Māori, and that's one end of the river to the other. Actually, they eventually, all the sewage was taken out of the river, and so I think again, it's another one of those markers that tells us how far we've come, and we've still got a long way to go. But yeah, I mean that river does actually has got its life given back to us in various ways. And isn't it funny that as that happens, as the treaty settlement begins to kick in, hopefully manifestly, that the town is actually feeling its oats and becoming an incredibly much to visit, much desirable town to go to.
Final word, David, to the photography that's in the book?
I'd like to thank Richard Seide and Alicia Young. They're wonderful. She's our younger daughter, and they are just so good at what they do, as you can see from the photographs. And they also allowed me to write some chapters without having to carry a carbon burden by taking a flight. So all the stuff, for instance, Easter Island was very much Alicia's project, and Richard picked up some wonderful work. This is partly because they've been photographers working at high-end educational cruise trips until the last couple of years. So they've got a wonderful array of photography, and I'm deeply in their debt.
Ngā mihi nui, ka kite. David Young, and the book is Why Pacifica? Indigenous Ways in a Changing Climate. It is published by Otago University Press with some support from Creative New Zealand.